Hello everyone, my name is Luis Aguilar, and in this video we're going to cover the basics of nested for loops. Now before I move on, I would recommend getting familiar with regular for loops, as this video is going to cover for loops in a very slightly more complicated manner. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. So nested for loops, right? What are they? Well, it's pretty simple. They are just for loops inside of another for loop. While this is a simple explanation, it can get easy to get confused when looking at a nested for loop. How, you may ask? Well, let's take a clock for example. We know that a clock has three hands: the second hand, the minute hand, and the hour hand. We also know that 60 seconds accumulates to a minute, and 60 minutes turns into an hour. And there are 24 hours in one day. Now you may be asking yourself, well, I know this, but why is this important for nested for loops? Well, it's important because we're going to dive deeper into the clock for our demo. So here we are on our demo on our program called clock.cpp. And here we have our basic formatting, which is IOStream, IOmanip using namespace std, and our int main. IOmanip is basically used for formatting. You'll see later on. So as we go down the program, we see that on line 7 and 8 we have our formatting, just to make it look pretty. And then here on line 10 we see that we have our first for loop, which contains hours. So like as we stated before, in order to quote unquote get an hour, it needs 60 minutes, which then will lead us to our second for loop on line 12, which is minutes. So this will take care of the minutes, right? And then we also stated that in order for time to be classified as a minute, it needs 60 seconds. So this will lead us to our last, for this example, for loop, which is seconds. So this is also called the innermost loop, which means that our first loop right here on line 10 is called the outermost loop. And for this example, minutes is called the middle loop. And as we go down more, on lines 17 through 19, we see that we are just outputting the values of the clock, and set W2 is just for formatting purposes. So let's see this in action, right? So let's see this run, and we see that it's basically running as a clock, right? It's running as intended, and here I'm going to force stop it using Control-C. So I'm just force stopping it here because we don't necessarily need it to go all the way to 24 hours because we know how a clock works, right? So we don't need to see it go all the way. But what we can see, if I scroll up just a little bit, we see that it starts at 0 and it goes all the way down to 59, and then it starts again, and then boom, it increments. Right, and then after the 50 minutes goes, we also increment here. So here we technically be on our 5th hour. Obviously this isn't the best program for a real clock because it goes by so fast. As you can see, 5 hours technically went by, or 6 hours I should say, technically went by in like seconds, which is, you know, perfectly okay just for this example only. So this was an example to showcase nested for loops by using a clock. Now you may be asking yourself, well, how can we apply this to more useful programs? And I'm actually going to show you that in our second demo. So here we have a program that its purpose is to average students' test scores. So here we have scores.cpp. As you can see on top, we have the same basic layout as we had on clock.cpp. So using nested for loop, we are allowed to specify how many students we want and how many test scores per student we want to input. So let's see that, right? Here on lines 7 through 8, we are just setting up our variables, so students, tests, and then doubles, total, and average. Here on line 10, we just have formatting once again just to make it look nice. And then lines 12 through 17, we are prompting for the amount of students and the amount of tests per student that we want. And then here on line 19, we see the main work of the program start. So here we start with our auto loop, that will be outputting the average score for students, and then we'll increment to n amounts of students, right? And if we go down a little bit more, on line 22, here, our inner loop, we will be inputting the scores for the n amount of tests we have for each student. So this will then total all the scores, as you can see here. So here will be our prompting. And then this will be the end of our program, right? So let's run and see how this plays out. So let's just run scores. So average test scores, right? This is just to showcase this is just to tell what the program is. So how many students we want? So for this example, let's just say we want 3 students. How many tests per student do we want? Let's say they took 3 tests. So now we are here. Enter test score 1 for student 1, right? So here we're currently here and we are waiting right here on line 26 T in score. So let's input that this student did very well. Got 100%. Good. And now we go back, right? We're still here, but as we can see, whoops, did not mean to do that, right? We're still here, but as you can see, we are now on test score number 2, but we are still on student 1, so we're still inside this for loop. All right, guys? So let's enter, just for say, didn't do so good on this one, and on the last one, we see he did pretty well on the last one, right? So 89, boom. All right, so now, after we input the 3rd test score, we see that we exit this loop, we are back here, and now we output the average score for the student, which would be 85.7. Now, we are going to enter the test score, the first test score, for the 2nd student, all right? So just to go through that, just input random numbers. Boom. We are back here again, and now we are on student 3. This means that average student is on number 3 now, right? So once we do that, enter the test scores again. Boom. We see the average again for the 3rd student. We see that this condition does not meet the standards, right? Because average student would now be 4 and the amount of students we have is 3. So that means this code is now exited, and then we return 0 and exit the program. So this video, we went over the basics of nested for loops. We covered how they work using the clock example, and we also went a bit more in depth with the student test scores example. One more thing I would like to show you guys is that with inner loops, or with nested for loops in general, we see that the inner loop goes through all of its iterations for each iteration of an outer loop. And we see that played very well in our scores demo, for example, right? We have to go through each test for the first student before we move on to the 2nd student. And then inner loops complete their iterations faster than outer loops. So this is a very important thing to know, because you need to remember that whatever is in the inner loop is going to be completed way before the outer loop completes. So that's something to keep in mind when working with nested loops. I hope this video helped you guys, and thank you guys.